People get addicted to safe relationships, like relationships where, there's no intimacy, or a single person always in relationship with married people where there can be no commitment and ongoing relationship. People get addicted to flat affect relationships, no feelings shared. And these are destructive, but we keep going into the same kind until we look at what the system is that's telling us what kind of relationship to get into. When I was talking about my collecting addiction, or some people call it hoarding, I didn't mention some other aspects to that. And it's not collecting, but some people are more addicted to the shopping, and some people are addicted to spending. And that's getting a lot of press. They've done a lot of articles in Minnesota about shopping compulsion and spending compulsion. And I've worked with people that have really destroyed their life with that. In fact, I have an uncle who has a billfold, and he has I think he's got 78 credit cards that he carries in the thing. And he has to have an attaché case to carry. And his monthly credit card bills is astronomical. I worked with someone that had built up $200,000 in credit charges in the past 6 months. They were upper income level, but not $200,000 in 6 months. So it is a serious addiction. There's a T-shirt that I saw. It's my second favorite T-shirt, and it says, "When the going gets tough, go shopping." So I don't. The T-shirt that I have, which is my favorite T-shirt. Actually, I have two of them since I have two of everything. He who dies with the most toys wins. The other thing I didn't talk very much about was sexual addiction, and I hope to talk more about that, but enough to say that, like, sexual addiction, no one knows how frequently it occurs. There seem to be more men sex addicts than women, and I think that has to do with that men have a tendency to sexualize intimacy, affectional needs, and then probably the counter of that is that some women have a tendency to affectionalize sexual needs sometimes, and so that men would tend to get more sexually addicted. Women very often get more male dependent. I don't know if that's more or not really, but sex addiction, there's even some people that are saying that it's occurring with about the same frequency as alcoholism in our society. And actually, there aren't people. I'm saying that. I might as well be honest. I'm thinking some people say it's 1 out of 5 men, and some people say it's 1 out of 60, and some people say it's very rare. I think it's very similar to alcoholism, and that you think of sex addict, you always think of an offender, someone who's hurting little kids, or someone who's raping or whatever it is. And most sex addicts, are not really offenders, or if they do the offender stuff, it's not like rape crime or child molestation. If you understand alcoholism, and that alcoholics have different drugs of choice. Sometimes it's only alcohol. Sometimes it's alcohol and cocaine, and sometimes it's anything that'll get you off, or prescription pills only. You can understand sex addiction in that term then, because sex addiction has a myriad of drugs of choice. The common ones are, of course, like compulsive masturbation, sexual fantasy, pornography is real common. But then you go on from there. I mean, sex addicts get addicted to, there's infantilism and diapers, and there's, like real bondage and discipline kinds of sex, group sex, heterosexual relationships, homosexual relationships. Not everybody is having homosexual relationships as homosexual. A lot of times it's a compulsive acting out. That's a drug of choice for a sex addict. What they might be doing is they might be acting out of their needs for fathering and sexualizing those needs, or male intimacy needs, and they sexualize intimacy needs. They might be reenacting an abuse issue where they were homosexually abused, and that they kind of repetition compulsion sets them up to repeat that experience, and they become addicted to that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're gay. It doesn't mean that they're not gay, too. And a lot of gays are in a lifestyle that sort of forces sexual addiction, a myriad of partners, a lot of cruising in gay bars, so there is a lot of addiction, too, among gays, but there is a lot of homosexual acting out of people that aren't gay. It's just a different drug of choice. A drug of choice might be little kids, it might be affairs, non-intimate relationships, it might be sex within a marriage, and all of that can be part of the addiction, or the addiction itself. Again, you get multiple drugs of choice, and some people, do fetishes, and you get addicted to bicycle seats and feet and shoes. You start to sexualize a lot of different things. In fact, if you look at what sexual addiction is about, or even how it begins, like, a real common story that I hear if I'm working with a person who's sexually addicted is that, they'll talk about like maybe isolation in their childhood, and they're with themselves, and they don't have any place to go with the feelings about being left alone, so they turn inward, and what they discover in their pain is that they can fondle themselves and get some release from the pain, and maybe begin to masturbate at a very early age. And then what they've done at that point, where they're using that to release their pain, is they're kind of objectifying themselves. They're using themselves in an objectified way to relieve unwanted feelings. Now, in that objectifying, they continue, and maybe they don't ever develop socialization skills, but they continue to objectify, and they use pornography and a lot of fantasy, and maybe bookstores or prostitutes. Or maybe they develop the socialization skills, but it's a way of satisfying the addiction, and so they're very charming, gregarious, and seductive, as a way of satisfying their sexual needs, not as a way of learning about and having relationship. See, once you objectify yourself, then you tend to objectify the rest of creation, other people and objects and animals. And bestiality is not an uncommon thing for sex addicts to have acted out with animals. So the objectification then is an alienation. And the more the person gets alienated, the more they need the addiction as a feeling of false connectedness. Especially, the fantasy of connectedness with the centerfold, or the seeming connectedness with the seduction process, or the seeming intimacy in a group sexual experience, or the seeming fathering, and so, but since it's only a surface connection and it doesn't meet intimacy needs, the person gets more alienated, so they escalate the sexual need. And pretty soon their belief system, their feelings about themselves, they go into shame, their boundary breakdown occurs, and they start acting out. Sometimes they go beyond the lines of the law then, and they get into voyeurism, they get into obscene phone calls, they get into flashing, exposing themselves, they get into indecent liberties, window peeking, and cruising, and so, it's like, and you see the isolation so clearly in those things. Like an addict will sometimes sit for 2 or 3 hours by a window, maybe masturbating at the time, but for 10 seconds of semi-nudity, or they'll cruise 8 to 12 hours, looking for a place to expose themselves, or looking for some kind of a sexual connection. And pretty soon, the only vision you have is of what satisfies the sexual need. And it's like, you're sort of filtering out reality, and you get tunnel vision about just, and sexualizing those things. So that sexual addiction, I think it has a huge impact, and that's why I'm talking about it, on our society. It has an impact on all of us, that we have a lot of sexual addiction in our country, just like alcoholism has an impact on all of us. There's a book out about sexual addiction, and I think it's good. But I think that the idea of I think an addict is an addict. And, whether we're level 1, 2, or 3. According to the book, it breaks it into levels of how whether you break the law and how big the law is that you break. And see, level 3 is a rapist and a child molester and an incest. But I still think that some of us have an offender orientation, and some of us were violently abused, and that we're more likely then to be offenders. But most addicts are just addicts, and like some alcoholics beat people up and drive like crazy and run over people, but we don't call them level 3 alcoholics. They're just alcoholics. So what I maintain is that sex addiction, is a progressive disease, that it has a huge impact on society, and it's a lot more frequent than we care to look at, and it affects in some ways a lot of us. Affairs are a real common part of sex addiction. I'm going to maybe talk some more about that too, but I want to go on. I also, we just touched on the eating disorders, and as long as this is about addiction, I want to talk a little bit about eating disorders. There's really 4 basic kinds of eating disorders. There's compulsive overeating, and I talked about some of the frequency with that one. There's bulimia. Bulimia is the binging and purging, And we're not sure about the frequency of bulimia, but it seems to be that maybe it affects mostly women, 5 times as many women as men, and the age range is from mostly about 16 to early 20s, 25, and statistically it's maybe 1 out of 125 of women in that age group, and then there's other age groups as well that it affects. But the binging and purging, the purging is usually vomiting, although sometimes it's laxatives or diuretics that are used, even enemas. In fact, I think that in the past, maybe enemas were more common as a way of purging than vomiting. Vomiting wasn't quite in vogue then. And I'm not talking about Roman times, I'm talking about when I was growing up. I remembered, a lot of people did enemas regularly. The other kind of bulimia is exercise bulimia, where you really work off, the calories. It's really kind of like 2 addictions. It's an addiction to the binge eating, but it's also an addiction to the release, the catharsis, the purging itself. You get rid of the calories, and that feels so freeing. Also gives you sort of a semblance of control over the first addiction, which is the binge eating. Overtly, it seems to start mostly as a dieting kind of thing, and then, but covertly, it's usually connected to grief or loss, broken relationship, leaving a family, and that's more of the beginning of it. It's also tied into a certain kind of family system more often than not. It's usually a chemically dependent family system. About 60-some% of all bulimics came from chemically dependent families. And about 2/3 of all bulimics, their recovery program is to become chemically dependent. Like, chemical dependency is the most common cure for bulimia. It's not the one that we recommend in treatment necessarily, but what they do is they start using, and that sort of balances out the bulimia, and then when their bulimia is bad, they're using less, and when they're using more, their bulimia is more in control a lot of the times. Bulimics will go for an average of 4 or 5 years before they ever talk to anybody about their disease. And there's a lot of isolation and pain and shame. The most serious danger from bulimia, I think, is suicide. That bulimics get so hopeless, and their attempts to control, don't last very long, and they're isolated in their shame, they just decide that it's not worth living anymore, that they can't get help. There is some physical problems, like the stomach acids can rot the teeth and burn the esophagus, and so a person can choke to death, possibly if they get a hole in their esophagus. And there's also like electrolyte imbalance and chemical imbalance in the body from the vomiting. The bulimic family, I said, was more often alcoholic or chaotic, and sometimes even violence is in the family system. And the bulimic in their disease is sort of like acting that chaos and the ups and downs of the family. It's sort of like it's a chaotic kind of addiction. Bulimics are very aware of their problem. At some point they become aware of the problem, and there's a lot of recovery available for bulimics. For any of these addictions, there's a lot of recovery available. Sex addiction, there's recovery available. 12-step programs and support groups and treatment programs. Anorexia is the refusal to eat, and that affects, again, 20 times more women than men, and they figure about 1 out of maybe 200 to 250 women in the age range of 12 to 18 become anorectic. And anorexia is marked by being like maybe 20-25% under normal body weight. Now, the anorectics family system is a little different than the bulimics family system usually. It's a system where it's more success-oriented. Both tend to be middle to upper middle class. Success orientation, feeling denial, everything has to look good. The bulimic is very often kind of the good kid or a star child. The anorectic is even more so. Sometimes they are the star child in the community. And the family is marked by control. The family is marked by overprotectiveness. A lot of rules and no feelings, and what the kid does is they sort of turn the family, function back on the family, and they, like you have to come from a highly controlled family to be able to not eat, right? I mean, I don't have a chance in the world to become, well, I shouldn't say that, but I'm not likely to become anorectic. I don't have that much control. Overeating is easy, but the refusal to eat would be real tough for me. So they take that control and they take that non-feeling stuff and then they drive the family crazy and they control the family. They even become gourmet cooks very often. And they'll binge to an anorectic is an apple slice, but they'll force other people to eat all this stuff that they cook. That's frequently the case anyway. Dad is usually successful, somewhat absent from the family, and a lot of feeling denial. Mom is usually a fairly intelligent person, actually very intelligent, but they sort of subjugated themselves to the family and the family needs and to Dad and Dad's career. Sort of gave up their career very often or didn't pursue the career they wanted, but don't deal with any of the feelings about that. And I think the anorectic sort of takes those feelings and takes the success of the family and they turn it into a family nightmare. The problem is that the anorexia is more like alcoholism, and that alcoholism is such a high denial system, and the anorexia is in that denial delusion. They don't see that they're, they'll look in a mirror and their reality is that they see fat, when all someone else will see is skin and bone. So they lose the connection to reality, and that's a lot like alcohol. And I think it takes a time like alcoholism to treat as well. There's very little treatment being done, though, where they're dealing with the family systems and the feelings in the family. So much of it is just behavioral, and I think that's first. Very often hospitalization is the first need, and get the person's body weight up and functioning. See, when you stop eating also, it increases the delusional capacity because your brain isn't working very well anymore either. I think that the most common cure for anorexia is bulimia. That what the person will very often do is accede. They will start to eat, but then they discover that they can purge and they become bulimic. And so that term bulimerexic, and a lot of people say I'm bulimic anorectic or bulimorexia. And I really see that that's usually an anorectic who has discovered bulimia as a way of dealing with it. Not always, but and the family system matches the anorectic's family system more than even the bulimic's family system. It's 20% fatal. Very high fatality rate, very serious disease. And treatment is available, but it is more difficult than like bulimia, I think. The last one is, the last eating disorder is called thin fat. Thin fat is a person who doesn't necessarily gain weight or lose weight. Like a bulimic might be a little overweight, but normal weight, but they're purging. See, and that's a thin fat person, usually maybe a little under to a little over, but normal weight range. But what they do is they always worry about food. They obsess, they're frightened, and they think about it. And it's the obsession that's the addiction, the worrying. And their life revolves around food. They'll have a donut and they'll go into a spiral, of concern about gaining weight, or that they ate something bad for them. And they're planning their food intake, and so it's the fear and the obsession of food. And they don't get much sympathy. From some of us especially that tend to be fat. We don't give thin fat much sympathy, even though their life might be more, controlled and obsessed by this disease than ours. Just occasionally binge and gain a little weight. And so they have a hard time getting help for their problem, and they very often don't get help. We don't have any idea statistically of how many people are in thin fat. All addictions are about feelings, and the eating disorders follow that. And if you look at what a person does with their feelings that has an eating disorder, it's like a compulsive overeater is a person who stuffs food down and stores it by way of fat cells. They also do that with feelings. They're using the food for feelings. They really stuff their feelings and store that. And one writer talks about how every fat cell is like an unshed tear. See, and it's a storage of the feelings. I think also it's more about anger than probably even pain, and tears. And that, to dig your grave with your teeth is an angry act. And that the idea of where anger centers so much is on the stomach, that of course, to fill the stomach with food and turn your tight gut into a full gut, it makes sense. And we even have a myth about how people that are fat are easygoing, jolly, and all this stuff. And, I don't buy the myth, but I think it says something about that people who use food to cover their anger, are more likely to gain weight. So it's the stuffing and the storing of feelings. The bulimic is a person who will take their feelings in, but immediately want to get rid of them, but they don't have that offender system to get rid of them, project them onto other people, so they just get rid of them, they take food in, they get rid of that, and that's the feeling process, getting rid of the feelings with the food. And they also tend to get overwhelmed, and that's the binging. They get overwhelmed with feelings, take them all in, and then try and get them all out. An anorectic is basically a person who says no feelings. I will not feel. And that refusal to eat is tied in with their refusal to have feelings. See, the word food actually becomes the feeling. Thin fat is a person who is afraid of their feelings, they're worried about their feelings, they get obsessed by their feelings, but they make it about food instead of feelings. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but the other thing is that in family systems there's a way that sometimes our reality gets taken over by someone else's reality. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but I notice that eating disorders have that very much, where a person with an eating disorder was not allowed to become themselves, and they were forced to almost like take someone else in, and that in some ways, like I don't know if compulsive overeating would be considered making room for the other person or eating for two, but it's like there is some other reality that's in the person that isn't the person, that's got the addiction. I think the bulimia is a way of trying to get rid of that other. See, in a family system, when there's unwanted reality, or when another person sets someone else up to carry their reality, then you get taken over by that, and you don't know who you are anymore, and you're more prone then to an eating disorder. And the anorectic, I think, is saying, no, don't take me over. I won't let you in here. I won't let you take over my reality. And the thin fat is that I'm going to worry about this, but I'm not going to be able to do anything about it. I'm helpless. Well, that's enough on the eating disorders. Do you have any questions about those? Yes.
On the thin fat, I'm still looking for an example. A lot of fluctuation. A person will diet for a long time and then maintain, and then say the hell with it. Is that it?
Not so much. No, it's not that they go from thin to fat. It's just that they worry so much about being thin or fat. And my friend who is thin fat, and she can talk about it very clearly, I was with her, and we stopped at a donut shop, and she ate a donut. And she was angry and moody and depressed after she ate that donut. And the thing is, then she talked about how before we went to that donut shop, she was afraid that that's what we were going to do, that we were going to go to a donut shop, and that she might eat something that wouldn't be good for her or that would start to gain weight. And she had gained 3 pounds. She's fairly thin, but she had gained 3 pounds over a period of about a month, and she was very worried about that 3 pounds that she had gained. That's what I mean by thin fat. Or that's an example of it. There's certainly other ramifications of the illness.
The most subtle than the four.
I would say, the question is that the most subtle of the four, and I would say yes, it is. I think it's the hardest one to spot. Well, you don't exactly spot bulimia, but it's it's hard to tell that a person is acting out bulimically. Okay? Yes.
I spent a 4-day weekend trip with a friend who's healthy to help her watch the diet. Tell me if I'm eating too much. And then when I did, she just resented it so much.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What happened?
You got schnookered by having Okay, if you're with a friend that's forcing you to watch their food intake, there's 2 parts. One is that they want to be taken care of, and they'll appeal to that codependent core of us. Yes. And the other part, though, is that there's so much shame in getting confronted about how and how much we're eating that, like when we're talking about objectively, we don't feel the shame. And all of a sudden you say, hey, you're eating too much. Immediately defensiveness, protect the food source, get into the shame, you're being attacked, and then turn it back on the person who's, So it is a bit of a setup, yes. Yeah. And I think that still, sometimes we care. Oh, we got this no talk rule about people's food stuff, don't we? I think it's easier to talk about people's alcohol use than their food use, and people kill themselves with a knife and fork as often as they do with a bottle. And if a person's eating themselves to death and no one around is saying anything about that, if you get attacked or not, it's still like you're going to let them jump off the bridge, or, you'd form an intervention. And we do eating disorder interventions in our clinic. We have the family come around and say, this is what you're doing to yourself. This is how I feel when I see you doing it. This is the reality, and this is our grocery bill. No, we don't. But incidentally, with bulimia, bulimics can consume they can consume 10, 20, 30,000 calories at a sitting. And the expense of bulimia, it's like a habit that you have to support. And bulimics have a hard time supporting their habit, and the families. The groceries that you can go through are just enormous. A lot of bulimics, in an attempt to recover, will start binging and purging health food. Like they usually start out with like Wonder Bread and Twinkies, because that's easily digested, easily vomited stuff. And I'm sure Wonder Bread. Anyway, and then you go on to like health foods as a part of recovery, and it's not. Bulimics usually get enough. They don't die though of the nutritional deficit so much. Yes, question. Oh, yeah, that is the good news. No, I don't mean it's good news that the whole world is sick, but that's recovery. I'm already talking about recovery. See, we can't recover from what we don't know. And a lot of people do lectures, and they're a lot more popular than I am. I'm depressing. And yet I think that they're maintaining a system of denial when they say, oh, you can just positive think your way right into, through all this, and you don't have to look back, and you don't have to worry about addictions, and that's nuts. We have to look at how bad it is and make that real before there's any possibility of change. And I'm talking about systems theory right now. See, in systems theory, what's covert doesn't change. And what therapy helps people to do is make things explicit so you have a chance of changing those things. And so what I'm doing is I'm making addiction and how frequent it is, and that we have it explicit so we have a chance to change. And I've just begun, and like some places don't ask me back because they don't like to get depressed. But there is some reality in the fact that we have to be aware of how much of this stuff is happening. And especially when I talk about families and dysfunctional families, there's a ton of hurt happening. That's what addiction is about, is what's happening in families. Let me just talk about feelings for a few minutes, and then I'll talk more about that addiction process and how it ties into family. Feeling addiction, I mentioned already, I think, one. My dad, I said, is an alcoholic and a rageaholic. He is addicted to the anger. It's the only feeling that he will actually deal with, and then he tries to control that and eventually blows up. But he uses his anger as a way of release, as that's his release valve, and as a way of covering his fear and his pain and any other feelings, including his shame and his guilt that he might have. And his anger, I know that his rage impacted the family system at least as much as the alcoholism did. It controlled us. It set a terror or a fear-filled system within the family. That rage is a true addiction. And I could see it building. I could see the release, which is like getting drunk, and then I could see the relief that he'd have, and then the growing depression and the feeling bad about himself. So rage is one. Now, my dad had projected his feelings on others. I consider that like offender orientation, and that's something that he learned, where you give your feelings to others, and then you make them feel the way you felt. That's that offender system. But let's say you don't have that system, but you have the same like anger thing. Well, where are you going to turn it then? If you're not going to give it to others, who are you going to get rageful at? You're going to turn it inward. And then what does that look like? Depression. See, it's like, turning it out is the rageaholism. Turning it in can be a form of depression. And a lot of us are always angry at ourselves. And that's like our addiction. Some people, they do it sideways. Well, generally with anger, people either, get angry or get even or get themselves. But some of us get real sideways in our attempts to get even. And that's the sarcasm and the sideways anger and passive aggressive. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about anger. But anger can be an addiction. I think that sadness and suffering can be an addiction too. That you can actually get a belief system going that that's what you deserve, and that that you go from sadness to sadness to sadness and keep making choices that give you sadness. However, when a lot of us get sad, I think there's a tendency where we talk about, I'm in my self-pity, I'm in my, feeling sorry for myself. And I want to confront that too. That, we do that as a way of avoiding our pain and feeling the sadness. And that very seldom is that true. In fact, maybe we are feeling sorry for ourselves. But if you look at, just change a couple letters and say, feeling sorrow for self. Well, that's an important thing for us to do. That's a part of healing. And so not all sadness is just, you're in your self-pity or you're addicted to feeling sorry for yourself.